The sun had barely crested the horizon when I cranked the old John Deere to life, its familiar rattle echoing across the still surface of the pond. 50 years this ranch has been in my family. My grandfather dug that pond himself with a borrowed backhoe and the help of 3 neighbors. It's fed by a natural spring, nestled at the back of the property, shaded by old cottonwoods and ringed by cattails that buzz with dragonflies in summer. For decades, we fished it, watered cattle from it, and even skated across its frozen face in the colder winters that used to come through this part of the state. About a year ago, it started to silt up worse than usual. It happens. That's just nature. Leaves fall, topsoil runs off, and before you know it, the pond's too shallow to support healthy fish or get decent use. So I made a plan to dredge it. Nothing fancy, just a simple cleanup. I rented a machine, marked out a couple days on the calendar, and let the neighbors know there'd be some noise. That's when the HOA got involved. Now, let me be clear. The Homeowners Association wasn't even around when my family built this place. Back then, it was all open land and long gravel driveways, not one of these cookie-cutter developments in sight. But a few years ago, someone decided to parcel off nearby land, throw up high-end homes, and organize everything under an HOA. Somehow, through redrawn boundaries and administrative sleight of hand, they claimed jurisdiction over parts of my ranch, despite me being here since the Carter administration. I got a letter first. It was dressed up in legalese but came down to this. I was violating community standards by altering the pond without prior approval. They cited some clause about environmental disruption and possible consequences for unauthorized excavation. I called them up to explain that the pond had been there before most of their board members were born, but they weren't interested in history. They wanted paperwork, permits, and a stop to all activities until I complied. I asked them if they'd ever stepped foot on my land. Of course, they hadn't. They sent someone a few days later. A man in a polo shirt and khakis who introduced himself as the environmental compliance officer for the HOA. I asked him if he had any formal training in wetlands management. He didn't answer. Just walked around with a clipboard, snapping photos and frowning dramatically. He warned me again that continuing the dredging project could result in fines, even legal action. I asked him to leave. He said he'd be filing a formal complaint. I'll admit it got under my skin. This was my family's land. My grandfather built that pond. My father taught me to fish there. I taught my kids to do the same. I wasn't trying to build a condo complex or divert a river, I just wanted to clean up a muddy old pond. But something in me said, wait. Don't go full steam ahead, not yet. So I did some digging of my own. Not in the pond, but in the county record's office. At first, everything seemed normal. The property lines matched what I remembered. But then I came across an old, yellowed document tucked into a supplemental file, something that hadn't been digitized, probably because no one thought it was important anymore. It was a land easement, signed in 1973, that conveyed a strip of land, just about where the pond sits now, from my grandfather to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. A handshake deal to preserve the natural spring and its surrounding wetland, as part of a broader federal conservation initiative during the early environmental movement. And it was still valid. I sat there staring at it, my fingers going numb. That little triangle of pond and trees, the one the HOA thought they had any say over, wasn't even mine. It was federal land. My grandfather had basically donated it with the understanding that the family could continue to use it for agricultural purposes, but the legal title had passed on decades ago. That changed everything. I contacted the regional office for Fish and Wildlife and asked to speak with someone about the easement. They were surprised anyone still remembered it. After some back and forth and a site visit, I was told that, as long as my dredging didn't violate certain environmental protections, no chemical dumping, no disturbing endangered species habitat, it would likely be approved with a minor permit. I filled out a single-page form, attached some photos, and waited. 3 weeks later, I had a signed approval in my hand. When I called the HOA to inform them that they had no authority over federal land and that I had permission from the appropriate agency, the silence on the other end was deafening. The compliance officer stammered something about needing to verify the documents. I offered to fax them over, or better yet, meet in person. He declined. They didn't apologize. They never do. But the cease and desist notices stopped. The letters stopped. The calls stopped. And I went ahead and dredged the pond. It was a slow process, even with the machinery. I worked mostly alone, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. It felt personal. Every scoop of silt pulled up from the bottom brought back memories. My brother falling off the old dock, my dad fixing up the little tin boat with a fresh coat of green paint, my daughter catching her first base. By the time I finished, the pond was deeper, clearer, and more alive than it had been in years. The irony isn't lost on me. The HOA tried to throw the book at me, not knowing they had no book to throw. They were so sure of their authority that they never bothered to check the land's real status. They saw themselves as gatekeepers, guardians of order in their manicured world of bylaws and regulations. But they never stopped to think that maybe, just maybe, not everything falls under their umbrella. Sometimes, history outruns paperwork. Sometimes, a 50-year-old pond knows better than a fresh-off-the-lot HOA committee. And sometimes, a man just wants to clean up what his grandfather started, without getting tangled in red tape. I still fish that pond. Still sit by it some mornings with a thermos of coffee and watch the herons glide in like ghosts. It's deeper now, cooler, healthier. And every time I look at it, I remember that the land holds secrets deeper than silt, some that even the loudest bureaucracy can't touch. Sure, here's an expanded version of part 2 of your story, continuing with the situation of the HOA and the revelation about the federal land. When I got the notice from the HOA, it felt like a slap in the face. A sharp, impersonal letter delivered by mail, typed in stiff legalese, telling me I had violated community regulations by dredging the pond on my own property. According to them, I needed immediate approval for any major alterations to aquatic features, and I had allegedly disrupted a shared environmental resource. They claimed I might be damaging sensitive habitat zones, a phrase I'd never even heard in all my decades of ranching. The irony, of course, is that the pond had existed longer than the HOA itself. 50 years on the land, feeding cattle and collecting runoff through the dry Texas summers. I knew every inch of that pond. It was practically part of the family. I tried to reason with them at first, which in hindsight was naive. I sent back photos, historical maps, and even an old photograph of my grandfather standing waist deep in the pond with a busted fence post and his overalls rolled up. The HOA didn't care. They weren't interested in history or logic. Just in control. They cited bylaws that had apparently been ratified years after I even bought the property, and claimed that my aquatic modification posed a risk of erosion and sediment discharge. They talked about fines, legal escalation, and possible restoration orders. I didn't even know you could be banned from your own pond. But that's exactly what they threatened. Until further notice, I wasn't to perform any maintenance or work around the water feature. I was furious, but more than that, I was confused. I'd dredged the pond before. Twice in fact. Once after a flash flood back in the 90s that filled it with debris, and again after a decade of drought when the silt choked up the feeder stream. Nobody had ever said a word then. But now, suddenly, this was a violation. It didn't make sense. That's when I decided to start digging. Not the pond this time, but the records. I went down to the county clerk's office, a place I hadn't visited in years, and started pulling every land record, deed, and survey I could get my hands on. I traced the original purchase back to 1973 when my grandfather split off part of the family acreage and handed it down to my father. It had changed hands officially just once, to me, in 1998. All the boundaries seemed clear, Until I found one old federal document from the Bureau of Land Management tucked in with an obscure parcel record. It referenced a water allotment area and shared riparian rights, along with some vague language about federal oversight in cases of structural modification. The more I dug, the more things unraveled. It turns out that about 40% of my property, specifically the pond and a strip of land about 200 feet wide, wasn't technically private land. It was part of a federally administered water reserve program that had been dormant for decades. According to a clause buried in an old Water Resource Development Act addendum from the 1980s, the pond had been surveyed but never officially deeded to any individual. My family had used it without interruption, generation after generation, under the assumption that it was part of our ranch. But in reality, it was federally managed land the whole time. This revelation was a gut punch and a relief all at once. On one hand, it shook the very foundation of everything I thought I owned. But on the other, it meant that the WA had no jurisdiction. Not even a little. Their bylaws stopped at the property lines of the private plots within the development. They could regulate lawns and fences and architectural paint swatches, but not a federal water body. And certainly not one they didn't even know existed on government land. Armed with this, I contacted a land use attorney, one who specialized in federal disputes. He reviewed everything, and his first reaction was the same as mine. This pond had been wrongly assumed as private property for generations, but because of continuous and unchallenged use, the government had never enforced any restrictions. Still, he advised we tread carefully. Just because the WA was out of line didn't mean the federal government wouldn't have their own opinion. So we filed a formal request with the Bureau of Land Management to clarify jurisdiction and usage rights. It took weeks. Government bureaucracy moves at a glacial pace, but eventually, we got our answer. Yes, the pond and surrounding land were under BLM oversight. No, the WA had no authority there. And yes, I could continue basic maintenance and dredging, provided I followed standard environmental practices and didn't alter the pond's size or flow. In short, I was allowed to do what I'd been doing for decades, legally. When I presented this to the WA board at their monthly meeting, their reaction was a mix of disbelief and awkward silence. The president, a man who had moved in 5 years ago and seemed to think he was some sort of sheriff, fumbled through his paperwork while a few of the board members whispered among themselves. I handed them a copy of the BLM letter and let the silence stretch. Eventually, they conceded. Not with an apology, of course, but with a curt acknowledgement that their enforcement would no longer apply in that specific instance. That was good enough for me. I walked out of that meeting with my head held high, the letter folded in my back pocket like a badge. I didn't need to prove anything to those people, but I had. I'd dredged my pond, stood up for my land, and exposed their overreach. The ranch was still mine, the pond was still mine to care for, and now the truth was etched into record. They never had control of that water to begin with. And the pond, it's cleaner than it's been in years. The cattails are back in bloom along the edges, the runoff flows true again, and my cattle have clear water to drink. I even stocked it with catfish last spring. Some things, after all, are worth fighting for, not because they're grand or profitable, but because they're part of who you are. This wasn't just about dirt and water. It was about roots, about legacy, about standing firm when others try to claim what they don't understand. So let the WA try and police their mailboxes and porch railings. As for me, I'll be down by the pond, where the water runs deep and the boundaries are finally, rightfully, clear.